1701 to 1770 was the time period before the Revolutionary War. The colonies were under the control of English monarchy, but not for long.
The Tuscarora Indian War took place between 1711 and 1750 between the British, German, and Dutch settlers and the Tuscarora Indians. The Europeans enlisted the help of the Yamasee and Cherokee Indians against the Tuscarora. They defeated the defeated Tuscarora, signed the treaty in 1718, and settled on a reserved tract of land. They lived in peace with the Tuscarora Indians for over 50 years at a time, when every other colony had reported problems. The settlers encroached on Tuscarora land, raided their villages, and introduced epidemic diseases.
This was the first successful engine of this kind. It was invented by Thomas Newcomen in 1712. It made use of technologies discovered by Thomas Savery and Mr. Papin. This was a big part of the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution as it helped make more useful and efficient ways to transport materials and goods. This was big news because it will impact for years to come. The Great Awakening was all about religion. It was part of the religious revival that swept the colonies. It focused more on individualism instead of the original church settings. Many preachers made names for themselves in this period. They preached a message that was set for personal reflection and individualism rather than the church reflection. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards became popular for teaching slash preaching this type of message. Many people changed their point of view for worship, and some believed they didn't have to go to church anymore.
The Stono Rebellion was a slave rebellion that began in the colony of South Carolina on September 9, 1739. It was the largest slave uprising in the British American colonies, with over 21 whites killed and 44 blacks killed in the process. The uprising was led by a native African by the name of Jemmy, the rebel leader, who was a slave who led 20 others in an armed march south from the Stono River. They were marching to Spanish Florida, where the Spanish were promising freedom to slaves who could escape from the British colonies. The 20 men recruited almost 60 others, and they killed some whites before they were intercepted by the South Carolina militia. A group of slaves who had escaped and traveled another 30 miles before battling another militia a week later. Most slaves were either executed, but the survivors were sold to markets in the West Indies. The French and Indian War was fought between the British America and New France in the years 1754 to 1763. The French had populated only 60,000 colonies near the beginning of the war, while England had over 2 million people in the American colonies. After a long time of conflict, both countries declared war on one another in 1756. In 1755, colonial governors met with General Edward Braddock to plan the attack on the French. The French were destroyed in the Battle of Monongahela, July 9, 1755. The Acadians, some soldiers that were kidnapped, were expelled to make room for more English settlers. After a failed expedition against Louisbourg at the siege of Fort William Henry, the British government in America toppled. The outcome of the war was one of the most important developments in a century of Anglo-French conflict. The outcome of the war was one of the most important developments. The French seceded to its territory east of the Mississippi to the British Americans. Spain was compensated the French territory west of Louisiana for their loss of Florida to the British. The war also confirmed the British power in eastern North America.
This was a document passed by King George III that said no one can settle past the Appalachian Mountains, and the main reasoning behind this is because he was trying to please the natives and make sure they still had
The Sugar Act was approved on April 5, 1764 by the Parliament of Great Britain. The Sugar Act promised a stricter enforcement of laws, regulated trade, raising revenue, and a tax on sugar. The act was wrote to resolve the problems of finance and control that plagued a post-war empire. The act created a huge economic loss for ports, which then led to riots. The Sugar Act was repealed 1766. The Currency Act was passed by Great Britain's Parliament on September 1, 1764. The point of this act was to control the colonial currency system. The Currency Act permitted any new bills from being made and didn't allow the reissue of existing currency. This act was repealed because of the post-war economic slowdown. The Stamp Act was passed by British Parliament on March 22, 1765. The Stamp Act put a tax on every piece of printed paper. The revenue from the tax was spent to help pay the cost of defending the American frontier. This act was repealed March 18, 1766. The Townshend Acts were a series of acts that were passed 1767. These acts were named after Charles Townshend, whom was the leader of the Townshend Acts. The purpose of the Townshend Acts was to raise revenue in the colonies. This act was repealed on March 5, 1770, which is evidently the same day as the Boston Massacre.
Stamp Act is a tax on all papers, letters, and etc. Citizens were so angry about this tax and all the money they were spending that they had riots and destroyed the stands that they went to get stamps so they could be taxed. Riots eventually even went overboard and killed the distributor of stamps, Andrew Oliver. A lot of riots happened, but the Boston riot was just one of the biggest riots.
Boston Massacre, also known as the Incident on King Street, took place on March 5, 1770. The British Army killed 5 male civilians and injured 6 other bystanders in the process. The Army men had been stationed in Boston since 1768 in order to protect colonial officials. A mob had formed around a British sentry who was being subjected to harassment and extreme verbal abuse. The soldier was surrounded by 8 more additional soldiers for support. The 9 men fired into the crowd with no orders. They instantly killed 3 people and wounded a number of others. 2 more people died later of wounds they received from the Boston Massacre. 8 soldiers, 1 officer, and 4 civilians were arrested and charged with murder. 6 of the 8 men were let off, and the other 2 were charged with manslaughter and were branded as their punishment.